Hey guys, what's up? How's everyone doing? I hope you're all doing great. Today's story is something that a user shared on Reddit a while back, and that's what I'm going to tell you today. I'll be narrating it from their point of view, and I hope you enjoy the story. Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our street, softly whistling. The whistling sound can only be heard from the living room or kitchen of my house, but not so clearly in my bedroom, which faces the back. Every night, without fail, the sound begins at exactly 3:03 a.m. At first, it's faint, coming from the far left side of the street. Slowly, it grows louder as whatever it is approaches my house. Then it becomes deafeningly loud as it passes right by my home, only to fade away once again as it moves further down the street. As a kid, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen to listen to the eerie sound. Sometimes, our parents would catch us, but they never got angry. Even though you could tell they didn't like it, they never scolded us too harshly. Maybe that's because of the one big rule in our neighborhood, the most important one: never try to look at whatever is whistling outside. The place where I live is kind of weird. I've been living there since I was 6, and honestly, I love it. The houses are small but well maintained. Each has a neat lawn, and there's plenty of space for kids to run around. I've grown up with a group of friends my age, and I'll be turning 13 this October, just like most of them. It's been a great place to grow up. However, there are two strange things about this place: the night whistling and the good luck well. The whistling never really bothered me. Like I said, I don't hear it too well from my room, but it does bother my parents. A lot. We've stopped talking about it altogether because of how tense they get whenever the topic comes up. My dad, who's tall, handsome, and always calm, changes whenever the whistling starts. He talks quicker, his eyes dart around, and he always reminds us of the big rule: don't try to look outside when the whistler passes by. I don't know why, but there's something about this neighborhood. Everyone who lives here is incredibly lucky. It's like all of us have some kind of charm. People get promotions without even asking. Small lottery winnings seem like a regular thing. And in general, good things keep happening. My parents don't talk about it much, but we all notice it. I've even seen it myself. We didn't always live here. We moved in because of my sister, Nola. When she was born, her health was terrible. Something was wrong with her lungs, and she couldn't even breathe on her own. She had to stay in the hospital for months. My parents were devastated, visiting her daily but feeling helpless. That's when we moved into this house. It was close to the hospital, and shortly after we moved in, Nola started getting better. The doctors were baffled, but all they could say was, "Congratulations, your daughter's improving." But we all knew why it was happening. Nola's recovery was just another one of those blessings that came from living in this neighborhood, and that's why we've stayed. It's a place where good things happen, unless, of course, you break the rule and try to see who the whistler is. Our neighborhood has a welcoming committee. Whenever someone new moves in, they get a warm welcome, complete with gifts like macaroni, chocolate, and a friendly chat. When we first moved in, I remember how kind everyone was, especially toward Nola, who had just come home from the hospital. They held her gently, but with so much love. Later, they took my parents aside to tell them about the whistler and the strange, almost supernatural good luck. My mom didn't believe it at first. She thought they were playing a prank. But my dad, calm as ever, saw how serious they were. He reassured my mom that they were just trying to help. Then he asked them the question that no one wants to ask: what happens if someone sees the whistler? Their faces turned grave. Most who do don't survive. Some make it, but not without consequences. That night, my dad bought wooden shutters and installed them over the windows. He locks them every night before bed and keeps the key with him at all times. The first night after I found out about the whistler, I stayed up late, waiting. At exactly 3:03 a.m., I heard it, the soft, haunting whistle. It came and went, just as our neighbors had said. I didn't try to look outside. I didn't even think about it. I just listened as it passed by and faded into the distance. And then everything was back to normal, just like always. Nola's breathing got stronger. She grew into a clever, strong girl. My dad even joined the welcoming committee, though new neighbors were rare because no one ever wants to leave. But just recently, someone new moved in across the street. Mrs. Maddie, who lived there before, passed away at 105 years old. She had lived a good life, so no one was sad, really. After Miss Maddie passed away, it didn't take long for the house across the street to be sold. A young couple, the Parkers, moved in with their 2 kids, a boy around my age and a little girl about 6. As per tradition, our neighborhood's welcoming committee visited them on their second night. My dad, being part of the committee, went over with a gift basket of chocolates and macaroni. I watched from my room as the neighbors gathered on their porch, all smiling and chatting. The Parkers seemed excited to meet everyone, especially in a place as close-knit as ours. The next morning, I overheard my dad discussing the meeting with my mom. "They seem nice," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "But, I told them the rules." My mom nodded, but she didn't say much. She had always been a little uneasy when new people moved in. The rules weren't exactly normal, and they weren't something outsiders could easily accept. And yet, they were essential. "Did they believe you?" I asked, curious about how the Parkers reacted to the strange warning. Dad sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Not at first. They laughed, thought it was some kind of local joke. But when I told them about Miss Maddie's passing and how she always followed the rules, they got quiet. I think they'll take it seriously now." I wasn't so sure. Most new families didn't really understand the importance of that one big rule. You could never look outside when the whistler passed by. Never. That night, the familiar sound of whistling drifted through the air at exactly 3 a.m., just like always. I was used to it by now. The eerie melody was almost comforting in a strange way. It meant everything was normal. As long as no one broke the rule, we were safe. But that night, something different happened. The next morning, I could tell something was off. Dad was more on edge than usual. He paced around the house, glancing out the windows, but careful not to open the shutters. My mom didn't seem her usual self either, whispering to Dad in the kitchen. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation. "The Parkers," Dad muttered, shaking his head. "I'm worried they didn't listen." "What makes you say that?" Mom asked, sounding nervous. "I don't know, just a feeling. They're new and they're curious." I didn't say anything, but deep down, I had the same uneasy feeling. I liked the Parkers. Their son Ben seemed pretty cool. We'd even hung out a couple of times since they moved in. I didn't want anything bad to happen to them, but I couldn't shake the creeping worry that maybe they hadn't followed the rule. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of the whistler. My heart was pounding and my mind raced with all sorts of horrible possibilities. What if they looked? What if the whistler saw them? At exactly 3:03 a.m., the whistling started. It was faint at first, just a distant, soft melody, but it grew louder as it approached. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the sound moved closer and closer down the street. Then something strange happened. The whistling stopped. For the first time in my life, the whistler paused in front of someone's house. Ben's house. My breath caught in my throat. My heart was hammering in my chest. I wanted to get up, to look out the window, but I couldn't. The rule was clear. You never look outside when the whistler is there. But why had it stopped? I could hear movement outside, the faint creak of footsteps on the front porch. I strained to listen, my body frozen in fear. Were they looking? Were the Parkers breaking the rule? A few agonizing minutes passed, and then the whistling started again, softer now as it continued down the street. But it was different, slower, offbeat, like the tune was, wrong. When the sound finally faded away, I didn't feel relief. Something was wrong, and I had a feeling we were about to find out what. The next morning, our neighborhood was quieter than usual. No one was outside watering their lawns or walking their dogs. It was as if everyone knew something had changed, but no one wanted to talk about it. I saw Ben standing on his porch, staring at the street. He looked pale, his face drawn and tense. I wanted to go over and talk to him, to ask if everything was okay, but something held me back. What could I even say? Later that afternoon, my dad knocked on the Parkers' door. I watched from our living room window, the shutters carefully closed. Ben's mom answered, but she barely opened the door. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then Dad came back home, his expression darker than ever. "What happened?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. "They didn't listen," Dad said, his voice low and grim. "They looked." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't need to ask what that meant. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what happened when someone looked. They might not die right away, but things would never be the same. Misfortune would follow, and it would only get worse. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. Why did the whistling stop in front of their house? Dad didn't answer. He just shook his head and muttered, "I don't know, but I think we'll find out soon enough." And he was right. Because that night, the whistling didn't follow the usual pattern. It came earlier than usual, and when it did, it stopped in front of our house. I lay frozen in my bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake my parents. The whistling had stopped in front of our house. This had never happened before. The familiar melody, which usually passed us by, had come to a standstill. My body screamed to move, to wake my parents, but fear held me in place. I listened intently, my senses hyper-aware of every tiny noise. The whistling had become unnaturally quiet, as if it was waiting for one of us to break the rule. My mind raced. Had we done something wrong? Did the whistler somehow know that I had overheard my dad and the Parkers? Was it testing us? Outside there was silence, so thick and oppressive it felt like it was pressing against the walls of our house, creeping in through the cracks. The air felt colder, and the stillness of the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. Then I heard it, a soft creak of wood. The front porch, my pulse quickened. It was on our porch. The whistler had never gotten that close before. My thoughts spiraled. What did it want? Why had it chosen our house? My mind replayed my dad's grim words. They didn't listen. Were we next? I heard the sound again. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They echoed through the silence, tapping lightly on the porch, inching closer to the front door. Every hair on my body stood on end. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the instinct to look, to see what was out there. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I knew what happened to those who looked. The footsteps stopped. Then there was a faint sound, so subtle I almost missed it. A tap on the window. Just once. Tap. I gripped my sheets tightly, my knuckles white as though the fabric could shield me from whatever was out there. Tap. Again, just a single deliberate knock on the glass. My bedroom window. I could almost feel the presence standing just outside the house, the icy cold air leaking through the cracks in the window frame. Something was watching me, waiting for me to break the rule. The next few seconds stretched into eternity. The tension was unbearable, my body stiff with fear. I could barely breathe. All I could think was, "Don't look," repeating it over and over in my mind like a mantra. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I listened closely. The whistling resumed. The familiar tune, though slower now, carried on down the street, fading into the distance. It was over. But the relief didn't come. The air still felt heavy. Whatever had happened outside was just the beginning. The following morning, the neighborhood was eerily quiet, more so than the day before. I felt like I was moving through a dream. My parents acted as though everything was normal, but there was a tension in the air, an unspoken dread hanging over us. At breakfast, I could barely touch my food. I wanted to talk to Dad about what had happened last night, but I wasn't sure how. Would he even believe me? He had always taken the Whistler seriously, but we'd never been personally affected by it. Until now. "Did you hear anything last night?" I finally asked, keeping my voice casual. Dad paused, his fork hovering over his plate, before slowly lowering it. He glanced at my mom, who was staring intently at her coffee. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence between us was suffocating. "You didn't look, did you?" Dad asked, his voice tight, more serious than I'd ever heard him. I shook my head quickly. "No, I didn't." He let out a slow breath, nodding. "Good, that's good." My mom didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She was scared. Maybe more scared than I was. Over the next few days, things in the neighborhood started to change. The Parkers became reclusive. Their once lively house now felt cold and unwelcoming. The curtains were always drawn, and the kids didn't come outside to play anymore. Ben, who had seemed so friendly and eager to hang out before, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors started swirling. Some of the neighbors whispered that they had seen strange shadows in the Parkers' windows at night. Others claimed they heard crying, muffled and distant, coming from the house. No one dared to ask them what had happened. Everyone knew better than to pry into matters involving the Whistler. But it wasn't just the Parkers. There were reports of the Whistler stopping outside other houses, too. The Wilsons, the Thompsons, even old Mr. Ramirez down the street. The pattern was spreading like a sickness creeping through our quiet, orderly neighborhood. Every night at 3:03 a.m., the whistling would begin, and every night it would stop in front of another house. The pauses grew longer, the tune more distorted, as though whatever was out there was losing patience. And every night I could feel it watching. A week after the Whistler had first stopped at our house, something changed. It was late, past midnight, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with the events of the past few days. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Then the familiar sound of the Whistler began. But this time, it was wrong. It started earlier than usual, closer to midnight than 3:03. The melody was off, slower, almost dragging, as though it was being pulled through mud. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Something was different tonight. The whistling grew louder, echoing through the street, but instead of moving past like it usually did, it stopped again. This time, it wasn't just in front of a house. It stopped at every house. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.